Yeah, this lecture, the precariat, Beaumont's cost disease, and mobile tax bases, can the welfare state survive? I have never had a lecture of this sort before in my life, so of course I'm a little uncertain, and of course some statements will be quite controversial, I think, so you are really free to intervene and question everything I say. But anyway, we go on. Mobility is the theme of this section of the master course. And to begin with internet, the number of internet users of world population was 18% 2005 and is now around 40%, going up all the time. And if I quote United Nations statistics, in 2013, the number of international migrants worldwide reached 232 million, up from 175 million in 2000 and 154 million in 1990. And you can read the media or Facebook every day. You see that this figure is today very unstable. I mean, people are coming from Syria, especially, every day into Europe. And if you take United Nations HCR, no, I forgot the initials, HCR. Well, anyway, the number of forcibly displaced persons has risen to over 60 million, the highest number ever, from 37.5 million a decade ago. No, actually, the thing about Syria, I should have said that now. That is this figure. It's not migration, it's forcibly displaced persons. And as I talked about in my first lecture, if you study currency transactions, dollars per day and citizen of the world, logarithmic trend, you see this very big increase from $2 a day to perhaps around $25 per day and citizen of the world. Extreme increase in money, capital, mobility. And of course, rich people can move their money to places where taxes are low. It's very difficult for national states to hinder people to move their money to tax havens. And here you have a man who has been quite famous those last years, Thomas Piketty, with his capital in the 21st century. In his monumental book, he estimates unregistered financial assets held in tax havens to at least 7% of world output. And he shows that the global distribution of wealth is almost as unequal as it was in the end of the 19th century. It was during the 20th century more equal, but now it's going up again. And the richest 1% own more than the rest of the world. And inherited wealth accounts for more than half of the total amount of the largest fortunes worldwide. So it's a sort of myth going around in international media that the real rich people are self-made men like Bill Gates or Swedish Ingvar Kamprad. But that's just a smaller part of the picture. The majority of those extremely rich people, they have inherited. They was lucky enough to be born in families, rich families. Here you have I know you have talked about Gini coefficients before, so I don't have to develop on this concept. And you can see that in practically every national state, income differences have increased between 1970 and 2015. I have taken some examples. In Sweden, we have gone from, it was around, it was little more than 20 in 1970, and now it's nearly 30, or 0.3, however you want to express it. In the United States, it has increased from 0.23 something to around nearly 0.4. And in China, it's even more extreme. It's gone from lower than Sweden, and to today it's more than 0.45. In China, extreme differences between Eastern China with Shanghai and Hong Kong and so on, and Western China near Tibet and so on. Extremely big difference. But in spite of that, and now I say something that astonishes many of my friends from the leftist movement, who always think that the differences always increase. Most of the studies made on the global Gini coefficients, if you take all of the 7.2 billion inhabitants of the world and make a Gini coefficient on everybody, the global Gini coefficient has decreased somewhat since 1980, from around 0.66 to today probably around, I haven't seen statistics because this is a long lag between when the statistics is collected for every states. And of course the statistics is very shaky in many parts of the world, but it's a clear evidence that it's down now perhaps in the level of 0.62 or something. And why? If you separate total income differences in international and intranational shares, you can see that smaller differences between nations more than compensates bigger differences within nations. And the reason is that a number of countries, especially China and India, a number of million persons have gone up from poverty to sort of global middle class incomes. So the national share is going up within nations. The class differences are bigger, but on the global scale we have a small decrease of the total Gini coefficient. But I put a question mark because it's a very shaky statistics. Okay, now first, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, they wrote a book, very much discussed, The Spirit Level from 2009. And here is one of the pictures from the book. They have made a chart showing the relation between income inequality on the horizontal axis and an index of life expectancy, math and literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage birth, a lot of social indexes, you could say. And they show that it's a very, very clear correlation between income inequality on the one hand and health and social problems. It's much more worse in more unequal countries. And you can see United States up there, very, and that's quite another picture if you compare it to sort of GDP per capita and sort of, that sort of economic measures. And Japan, it's a little astonishing, but Japan is even better than Sweden. You can, of course, and it has been very much discussed about this, their indexes and so on, but I will not go into that. The general picture, I think, is very clear that you have this sort of relation. And if you listen to politicians from left to right in almost all countries, they say that they prefer smaller income differences. But the question is, have they the power to attain lower income differences? I go back a little to Castells. If you remember, I talked about him the last time I had lectures here. He says the polarization between West and East has been replaced by a polarization between small islands of power, wealth and knowledge, and the black holes of poverty. And then we come to this guy standing with the precariat. He looks like this. He was here in Gothenburg just a couple of months ago. He says the global elite or plutocracy has around 6,000 members. The salariat have long-term employment. They receive extensive non-wage enterprise benefits and all forms of labor security. The proficients, the third category, consists of a growing number of people, often youthful, who are mobile self-entrepreneurs. Below them is the core of working class. The precariat, this is his very famous concept. The precariat consists of people living through insecure jobs interspersed with periods of unemployment with uncertain access to housing and public resources. Below them is the Lumpenprekariat. You understand what it means? It was an old German concept, the Lumpen class or underclass. And here I have made, this is not Standing's figure, I have taken this figure from some sociologists studying the modern class society, saying that if you have those two dimensions, living standard, material living standard on the vertical axis and degree of integration, you could say that the global elite or plutocracy with around 6,000 members, they are high up in living standard and fairly well integrated. Then you have the salariat. They have long-term employment. They receive extensive non-wage enterprise benefits and all forms of labor security. The core of the old working class have a little lower living standard, but they are well integrated. They join their trade unions and they have friends, they can help each other and so on. Then you have the proficients, of a growing number of people, often youthful, who are mobile self-entrepreneurs. They are normally not so well integrated. They do not belong to lots of organizations or trade unions or even employers' organizations. And then you have the precariat, down there, low living standard and not integrated. Living through insecure jobs interspersed with periods of unemployment, with uncertain access to housing and public resources, and under them is the Lumpenprekariat, or underclass. Just a little sociological experiment. How many of you sitting here would define yourself to belonging to the precariat? 5. And the rest of you, would you say, do you belong to the proficients or the salariat? Who think of yourself as belonging to the proficients? Some, yeah, 3 perhaps. And salariat, somebody? No, you are a student, so it's not so very relevant. But in many countries, I don't want to scare you, but many students in many countries are going, when they leave studies, to the precariat. Well, he criticizes Marxists. Marxists want to compress the precariat into old notions of the working class. It does not make sense to divide people into capitalists and a unified working class when the salariat receives a large and growing part of its income from profits. Well, actually, it's a little unfair. I mean, every modern Marxist hasn't this very simplified version of the class analysis. This is a classical Marxist analysis, capitalists and unified working class. But he has a point. Marxists are unwilling normally to accept this new class concept of the precariat. It doesn't belong to the old sort of Marxist notion of exploitation. Well, according to Standing, the precariat consists of three groups. Uneducated, bumped out of working class communities likely to listen to neo-fascist agendas. And I would guess that you five up there who said that you belong to the precariat will probably not say that you belong to this sort of precariat. Am I right? Yeah. And then second one, migrants, Roma and other ethnic minorities, disabled and a growing number of ex-convicts. I don't know. I would guess rather that you belong to the educated, plunged into the precariat after having been promised a career. Oh, perhaps it's not relevant if you're not finished with your studies. But anyway, this is the three main groups that Standing defines. And he says the precariat is at war with itself. It's an it. Not too much. Okay. If populist demagoguery had its way, the first variety would turn against the second, as has been happening in Hungary. And now in almost everywhere in Europe. You can see a clash between the first category of uneducated, bumped out of the working class on the one hand, and migrants coming into Europe today on the other hand. And Standing's proposition in this new situation is that every person, regardless of age, sex, marital status or work status, should have the right to a basic income, adequate to enable him or her to cover basic needs. This principle should be regarded as the most fundamental of the economic rights to be attained during the 21st century. It's even a movement for basic income. International movement, I don't know how many members, but you can go to the internet and Google on Standing and basic income, you will find lots of members and discussions about this concept. And Standing, again, a basic income as a right of citizenship would help counter the systemic insecurities that are pervasive in the open economies in the area of globalization. Basic income defined as income paid by the state as a right of citizenship to each member of society, whether he or she wants a paid job or not, and independently of other possible sources of income, would constitute an instrument capable of guaranteeing a right of material existence for the whole population. But both this precariat concept and basic income are dangerous ideas, not only for some old-fashioned Marxists, but also for neoliberals and social democrats. And why? For the neoliberals, basic income threatens to deprive the capitalist labor market of its disciplined working force. why should you be so disciplined if you know that you can get the basic income if your job is very dull and you have to work extremely hard? And social democracy is threatened because the working class might prefer to leave trade unions and stop working if they can live on basic income. Also, the unemployment benefit system, based on the income loss principle, introduced to make the middle class feel that they get something back when they pay high taxes, is threatened. You can listen to the professor of political science here in Gothenburg, Bo Rothstein. He is very, very angry on standing. He says he threatens the whole Swedish traditional welfare system. If everyone gets this basic income, the welfare state will collapse. And of course you can put the question, can the national states afford the basic income? Can we afford it? With growing living standard, when material needs were met, people demanded more of education, healthcare, children's and elderly care and culture. Services produced and financed to a large part by the public sector. So historically, public expenditure as percent of GDP increased with increasing GDP per capita. This is a very sort of average figure. Of course, it's a very big difference between different nations. But on the whole, historically, this was the pattern for a long time, that when GDP went up, the percentage given to public expenditure went up to a certain date, or you perhaps should say before the 1980s at least. Another factor behind the growing demand for public health and elderly care is an aging population. This also leads to a diminishing number of working persons in relation to the number of retired. A diminishing number of children saves some education spending, but this is not enough to cover the costs of the elderly. Here you have some United Nations. Of course, this is very uncertain. You can't make prognosis for 2060, but this is anyway what United Nations believe. That 1970, you see, you have a very broad bottom with lots of children. 2015, it's evened out. And 2060, you have a very heavy sort of top with lots of people over 65. And the situation is even more acute in Europe. In some countries, the population would diminish if they had no immigration. Here is the situation today. You see very much smaller magnitude of the number of children and more people in the Middle Ages. And this is the prognosis for 2050. You see, very many people like me, oh, I won't live then, but anyway, like I am today. I was in Italy not long ago and talked to a young woman who wanted to go to Sweden. She was so tired of the Italian attitude, male chauvinist attitudes, and she said, we won't have any children, never, with all those men who will not help us with anything we will have to handle. So it's very natural that they don't want to give birth to children. So you can think of that, all of you young men, if you want the women to make children, you must behave in another way. Okay, for this reason and because of higher material living standard, local and central governments spend more money on health care. And here you have a figure from WHO, the World Health Organization, general government expenditure on health as a percentage of total government expenditure. And you see that typically in Europe and in the United States and Canada and also some Latin American states and Australia and some even African states, they have more than 15% are spent on health of total public expenditure. And here is another man. His name is William Baumol. He developed this idea very long ago, but now he came with a new book in 2012 about the cost disease. And one of his examples is this. 1954, the total number of working hours needed to produce a television set in all stages of its production was around 600. Here is a television set. And now, the figure is around 20. But the time spent by a nurse to give medicine to a patient is almost the same. Here is a nurse and a patient. Oh no, I lost the last. If healthcare costs continue to increase by the rate they have averaged in the recent past, they will rise from 15% of the average person's total income in 2005 to 62% by 2000, in 100 years after. Of course, you can't make prognosis of that sort, but that is Baumol's estimation. The result of the cost disease is that in Sweden, if I take my own country for a while as an example, private consumption increases while public consumption falls as percentage of GDP. Here's a figure. So if the left-hand scale, that is consumption of public goods in percent of GDP, and the right-hand scale is private consumption as percent of GDP. So between 1980 and 2015, the consumption of public goods has gone from 21, 22 to today it's around 20, the red figure. Consumption of public goods has gone from around 35 in 1980 to around 27 or so today, and but the private consumption in relation to GDP has gone up from 22 to from 40 around to nearly 50. And this is of course absurd. I mean, most of us, at least I do it myself, I eat too much, I have too many pair of shoes in my wardrobe, I have lots of material goods, I don't need any more, but I will need more of healthcare probably, more and more. But anyway, this is the trends. During the last 15 years, tax income in relation to GDP has fallen from more than 50 to less than 43% in Sweden, and just a little above the average level in the European Union. In most other EU countries, the relation is nearly unchanged. But in Sweden and also some other welfare states like Denmark and Finland, it has also gone down, but not so much as in Sweden. And if you take OECD statistics, they made a survey of 32 major economies, the long-term trends of countries moving towards a low-rate tax regime continues to play out, even accelerating slightly. Also, taxes on capital income and wealth go down. So the degree of progressiveness in the tax scales goes down. The richer get more lower taxes than the poor. In most welfare states, other taxes like the real estate tax, not stupidly enough in Sweden, but in many, this is a stable tax base. It has gone up, but just enough to compensate the taxes mentioned above. And also you could say that with increasing problems to uphold equality in the public sector, the willingness to pay taxes decreases. And here is a typical, I went to Wikipedia and I found this. This is a typical sort of picture of the recent dominating sort of ideology, the perspective of taxes. It's a burden. But if you ask people, for several reasons, I would say that they see this trend with the diminishing public sector as negative. And it's not only people to the left, people all over the ideological scale say that this is bad. We should have more of education and public health and elderly care and so on. And one reason for this attitude, I would say, concerns gender relations. Because men dominate in industry and other sectors with increasing productivity, while women dominate in the public sector. In spite of lots of declarations from employers, trade unions and politicians, women continue to have lower wages than men. This was a Swedish woman, she worked at my department of economics here in Gothenburg. She wrote a paper showing that if all sorts of unpaid work at home, like childcare, cooking, cleaning, etc., are giving a sort of market value and are included in GDP, women probably today contribute more to GDP than men do in Sweden, and probably in most other welfare states as well. So, of course, you can ask, here is the typical family, a little old picture perhaps, but anyway. But in spite of this, the Nordic welfare states have a top gender equality ranking. The index includes economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, political empowerment, and health and survival. And the picture is this. The gender gap index is between 0.85 to 0.9 in the Nordic countries and in Germany. Could it really be so that South Africa, that's very peculiar, but yeah, probably also South Africa has a high. And if you see the countries with the lowest gender gap index, you find, of course, Saudi Arabia and Iran and parts of Africa. But the gender income gap for a long time has been around 20%. Men earn around 20% more than women. not only because of higher wages, but also per hour, but also because women work not so much, very much more part-time work, because women do most of the work at home still. And feminists and most political parties, at least in Sweden, they say practically every politician in Sweden today say that they are some sort of feminist. It was really funny to see my party leader Gudrun Schyman in the debate before the election of 1998. She asked the other party leaders, "Are you a feminist?" And they were very afraid, all of them. Yes, yes, I'm a feminist. So, yeah.
Just one small query. This is all in relation to taxes as well, what people pay in taxes. In Saudi Arabia, there is no tax, and women get money from the government for staying home or for educational things. So they're two different systems to kind of compare equality in relation to wages and income, because how it works in the Middle East is quite different to how it works here. To say women don't get things, they do.
Yeah.
But people don't know that.
Yes, I must say I don't know exactly how they make this index. As you see, it includes economic participation and opportunity, education, attainment, political empowerment, health and survival. So it's a very complicated, and how they handle this sort of differences in the tax system and so on.
They don't have a tax system. They're rich. They
Yeah, I know, yes.
So they have education to suit everybody, whether you name it.
Yeah.
The women get money from the government or from the families. They have a fantastic health system. It's politically empowering. Women have been given political rights now.
But they are allowed to drive cars,
well, that's not necessarily, it's not fundamental freedom to be able to drive a car. And if you ask them, they would want it. When I speak to them, they're not interested because men drive crazy.
Okay. I recommend you to take contacts with these people making this. I really can't answer, but if you take political empowerment, you can't say that women in Saudi Arabia has a strong political say, or
It's changing. They've got
okay,
women's political
okay.
power.
Oh, perhaps this is 2013. Perhaps it's changing. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I can just answer the question how they came up with this. They had 4 key areas where they measured. It was health, education, economic, and political position. So it's just not taxes that you pay. It's all these 4 key factors.
Yeah. I got very interesting. If you can restore the reputation of Saudi Arabia, you are welcome to do that. Okay. But anyway, if really we want to close this gap, it's very problematic, at least in Sweden, to do that without higher taxes, because we must then develop the public sector and also raise the wages in public sector, and that means higher wages for women. Then we have this problem with the environment, and if I quote Baumol again, the declining affordability of stagnant sector products makes them politically contentious and the source of disquiet for average citizens. But paradoxically, it is the developments in the progressive sector that pose the greater threat to the general welfare by stimulating such threatening problems as climate change. With rising material private consumption, you get this extreme environmental problems. Some of the gravest threats to humanity's future stem from the falling costs of these products, rather than from the rising costs of services like healthcare and education. And if I take Gunilla's, I asked her, and I was allowed to show her chart, relating human welfare and ecological footprints. And of course, there you have United States and also United Arab Emirates up there with very big ecological footprints. And of course, the real poor countries like Sierra Leone and Mozambique and Malawi, they have very low footprints, small footprints. And of course, in those negotiations, they are going to meet in Paris, as you know, now in December. Of course, people from the poor countries said, it's your fault. You have produced in the rich countries all those footprints. So it's up to you to do it first. We must have a chance to raise our living standard to a higher level. We are long a distance to go before we reach your extreme high level of material standards. So of course, we must understand people. Well, Sweden is not very high up. I don't even find Sweden here, but I suppose we are sound down there in the middle. We must take most of the costs for reducing the climate change effects. What time is it? It's 10 minutes to... Yeah, take a break. So for all of those reasons, people's needs, gender equality and environment, the conclusion should be money should be transferred from the consumption of material goods to education, health, elderly and childcare in the welfare states. So why do the politicians not listen? I think they do. I've been there was in the Swedish parliament for 11 years, and I would say that even my moderate colleagues, most of them, they wanted to solve this problem, I would dare say. But because of those mobile tax bases, they seek desperately other ways to organize and finance the public sector. And how to do it? In most welfare states, the answer was new public management. It first emerged under Margaret Thatcher in the beginning of the 1980s in United Kingdom. And the general idea was to mimic the capitalist market in order to attain higher efficiency in the public sector. I think we'll take the break now a little earlier, because we started a little earlier, because this new public management is a theme I will want to develop a little around. So let's take a break for a quarter of an hour.